Hey class, today we're going to begin discussing the media and the government. It's a love-hate relationship. So we're really going to be focusing on today on not necessarily the media's relationship with the government, but the ways the government tries to regulate the media. And that creates some conflict. So it primarily does this through the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. As I said, when radio really developed into or launched off the ground or even TV, oftentimes broadcasts would be out from certain stations would be out broadcasted by another that had a stronger radio signal, a stronger tower. So essentially the government controls the airwaves. They control what level of content goes on TV. They control who can access that material. That's why there's only certain material that people 18 and older can access. They control what people say on TV, what's revealed on TV. And just to start off, do you think this is a violation of the First Amendment? And what I'd like you to go through is to go through this form. You'll need to answer this question as you go along. But what are your thoughts on censorship for the common good? Should the FCC allow anything that content producers want to put on TV? Should there be some limits? We'll go back. So you're going to need to answer that form throughout the presentation. Please just make sure you're doing that, and you'll be all set to go. Right? There's about 4 questions after each section. So what are the regulations on broadcast media? Well, besides the fact that there has to be certain decency or certain, there are certain things. There can't be nudity on public TV. There can't be the use of certain 4-letter words. There can't be excessive gore. There's going to be things that are, sometimes drug use is, while you might see it in movies, it's not really shown on TV. There's some levels. So besides that fact, when it comes to the actual political environment, there's 2 rules, really. One is the right of rebuttal. This is when if someone's not attacked on TV, but criticized on TV, that person has to be at least invited to give a statement. They don't have to accept that, but there at least has to be some sort of communication between the media and whoever that person is to make sure that they have their fair say on the network itself. Now, it's not to say the network's going to be fair, but they at least have to offer. That's the first FCC rule. That's called the right of rebuttal. There's also the equal time rule. This is not so much on TV. It is on TV, but it's not on a program per se. Especially when we get around elections, many times now candidates use television ads. Well, if, let's say, NBC allows candidate A to have a commercial or an advertisement of some sort, they also have to allow candidate B, equal time rule. Now, they both have to pay for it, but they can't refuse service they can't refuse to air an ad for one person and refuse it from another. They have to essentially allow equal time. Also like you to go to form question part 2. Do you think the government should enforce some sort of fairness doctrine or some sort of fairness idea where, oftentimes people will say, well, the media is so biased or the media is so unfair. Do you think when they're covering an issue, they should have to give both sides equal time when it comes to the discussion of an issue, say if it's on abortion or gun control or immigration or the role of men and women, those types of things? Should the government force because they control the airwaves to be fair? If you guys go to form question 2 and answer that, you can pause this video and I'll get into it. We're done. It's a really interesting theory whether the government should do this or not. On one hand, a lot of political scientists and historians have really commented that that a rule like this, which actually did exist at one time until 1987, would help people to be civil with each other. And some people would say that the 1990s, right after, was the decline into partisanship, when Americans started becoming more and more partisan to the point that we are today, where we're very much locked into ideological standpoints. Some people have pointed to the absence of this rule, which we call the fairness doctrine, as the start of the lack of civility. I personally don't hold that view. I personally think it started around 2008, and not necessarily with Barack Obama per se, but more with social media. You guys might have seen some of that come through. That's just my personal take. But some people much smarter than me have said, with the fairness doctrine in place, that the government forces people to give both sides equal time of an issue, and they're fair to equal issue. That was when civility in the country took a downturn. As a historian, I have a much longer viewpoint on it, so I'm not hard for me to agree with that. But it's an interesting discussion nonetheless, and it's not one I have a well-developed opinion on, but I'd be more interested in starting out. But here's what happened. The FCC eventually discarded the rule in 1987, like I said, because it did not actually encourage actual debate. And then there's the other question, the First Amendment and all. Do we really want the government deciding what is fair anyway? Do we want the government deciding, well, you were fair on this issue, but not on that issue, and you guys were fair in this platform, but not on that platform? And what if the government favors a certain platform or not? What if the government themselves are being criticized? What if it's the president that's being criticized on a recent veto, or Congress is being signed on a recent bill that they passed? It gets pretty murky pretty quick. And do we really want the government deciding what is fair anyway? In some ways, this is an argument that Alexander Hamilton put forth when he argued that the Bill of Rights wasn't necessary, because it would force the government to decide what is free speech, what isn't free speech. And the fairness doctrine might be an example of that. So it's no longer in place. Only two rules are in place: are the right of rebuttal and the equal time rule. The fairness doctrine is defunct. The FCC also plays a role in net neutrality, which is the idea of, can the government stop internet service providers from throttling certain websites? So if Netflix pays Verizon more money, will Verizon speed up your Netflix binge watching? But if you have Comcast internet, well, you're out of luck. It's going to be a little bit slower for you. Can the government stop internet service providers from doing that? At one time, the FCC said, yes, we can. And that was what we would call net neutrality, that internet service providers have to treat every website with the same speed. We already reviewed net neutrality under the Commerce Clause of Article 1. So if you need a refresher, please look back and discuss that. I kind of gave an overview of both sides then. I linked that below right here. But in terms of, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but what I do want to focus on for today is, should the FCC treat internet service providers as telecommunications, and thus they have the ability to regulate whether they throttle speed or not, or should they treat the internet service providers as information services, and thus they have little regulation because they're not a communications company, and thus little regulation. So take a look at the recent developments here and answer question 3 on the form. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about regulations on print media. Print media has much more freedom than broadcast media. I've already reviewed that. Podcasts are a little different, but in some ways they happen online, so it's another question. But if neutrality is in place, that could be an issue too. So print media, when we talk about, again, print media and their online subsidiaries like the New York Times, Washington Post, or really in some ways online media too, what regulations do they have placed on them? Well, the big one is prior restraint, and we're going to talk about that a little bit below as well. But prior restraint, we talked about this in the First Amendment, is typically a gag order that's placed on the media coverage of court cases or certain sensitive government documents. This is typically done in one of two reasons. One, to protect national security, and two, to protect the presumed innocence of any of the accused that are currently in trial. And we want that, right? We want everyone to get a fair trial. So the media certainly can influence people. We certainly don't want the jury influenced in a negative manner. We want them to have a clear conscience when they make their decision. Then we want the decision to be fair. So prior restraint comes into play, where a judge may sometimes prevent any reporters from being in the room. Pennsylvania actually is one of those states where reporters are not allowed in any courtroom. They have to go off what other people in the courtroom said outside. But oftentimes, if prior restraint's in place, the people in the courtroom won't be able to talk about the court case until it's been decided. The media obviously cannot use libel or slander. They cannot defame a person, which would be willingly and maliciously reporting false information. If you heard about the Covington Catholic School case recently, there was a couple boys, a school trip to a pro-life march in Washington, D.C. in January. At the time, this video appeared of this 16-year-old boy with a Make America Great hat on. It seemed like he was blocking a Native American from moving forward, and the Native American was drumming and he was smiling. All was reported as this boy was essentially harassing this man. Eventually, it came out to be that the man walked up to him, and there was video evidence of that. So you could check out this Covington Catholic suit. So this school is actually suing the Washington Post for about $250 million. So if the media, in this case, a judge rules that the media willingly defamed this person and maliciously reported false information, then he's going to win a lot of money. Part of this, it goes back to that issue of the internet speed I was talking about yesterday, that sometimes speed isn't a good thing. We need information to come out before we make a decision. So what about classified information? I kind of talked about this with prior restraint. Can the government prevent classified information from being released? So we're going to click on this case. This is a highly important case, New York Times versus the United States, and this is a case you will need to know. So we're going to go to OAS, and obviously, so the facts of the case. In what became known as the Pentagon's paper case, the Nixon administration attempted to prevent the New York Times, Washington Post from publishing materials belonging to a classified Defense Department study regarding the history of United States activities in Vietnam. What the Pentagon Papers revealed essentially is that the United States was involved in other countries besides Vietnam. They include Cambodia and Laos. Congress hadn't authorized force in those countries, but because they often bled into the activities of the North Vietnamese army, the United States went in anyway. The president argued that prior restraint was necessary to protect national security, and this case was decided together with the United States versus Washington Post. So these were companion cases. So the question, because these were classified documents, did the Nixon administration's efforts to prevent the publication of what is termed classified information violate the First Amendment? In other words, can they use prior restraint in this case? The court, you can see here in a 6-3 ruling, said yes. The Nixon administration's efforts to prevent the publication of what is termed classified information violates the First Amendment. The key word here I'm going to highlight. Justice Brennan reasoned that since the publication would not cause an inevitable, direct, and immediate event imperiling the safety of American forces, prior restraint was not justified, or was unjustified. So national security cannot be a blanket statement for a source not to publish the information. There has to be an inevitable and immediate danger to U.S. forces before prior restraint can be enacted on a publication. Nonetheless, many media outlets are very careful about classified information and are reluctant to publish it, and they really do consider this question whether there is an inevitable and immediate danger to the U.S. forces, because it wouldn't be ethical to publish it even if they can. Again, there's an issue of can you doesn't mean you always should. So please answer question 4, and that will wrap up today's lesson.